Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. First, we have Lindsey Graham calls upcoming American deaths a noble death from xcancel.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that looks like a tweet from, I would assume, Lindsey Graham. I'll have to click the link. Let me see. I would assume that's from Lindsey Graham, yeah. Let me see. That's from Mario Nolf. Looks like it's loading. Let's see. Refer it, and then yeah, it's U.S. Lindsey Graham calls potential U.S. casualties noble death. Classic Graham. The man who's never met a military operation he didn't love is already pre-framing American casualties and noble sacrifices where the bodies are even counted. And yeah, that sounds like Lindsey Graham. He's very much a warmonger, and yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the people who would never see frontline action are the ones who are most for war, who could debunk it. I oppose the draft, but ultimately, if they were the ones on the front lines, they probably should be. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have what the ICE crackdown in China's one-child policy have in common from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine, and the subtitle and subheading is "Population Control is technocratic hubris at its most intimate and brutal." And I'd agree with that. If you try and control the population, whether it be through ICE or a state-mandated one-child policy, that's not very libertarian. Libertarian positions, people should be free to do whatever they want as long as they aren't hurting anyone else. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Social Contract in the app, posted by Pale Assistance 2265, and they said, "I've heard a ton of libertarians tell me that they're against social contracts, and some have even told me they don't exist at all. But isn't the NAP a social contract?" And personally, I guess you could make that argument. I would say that the social contract is ultimately, you have to do this, but ultimately no one has to obey the NAP if they don't feel like it. Violating the NAP is very bad, and you definitely shouldn't be doing it. But, ultimately, people are going to justify what they justify. If they want to justify violating NAP, ultimately, they're going to justify it. And I personally don't care for that. But I don't say that it would be a form of social contract. I guess you could argue in some extent it is, because, you should definitely not be doing it. I would say it definitely should be stigmatized if you were to say shoot up a school or something like that. But, ultimately, people are free to choose what they want to do, even if it might be a bad decision. I think that's very much how libertarianism works. Next, we have Liberty vans appear across the U.S. to help immigrants and document ICE raids from TheGuardian.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really, if people want to do that, I think they should be able to. I personally, if I were, I personally would kind of avoid ICE because, you don't want to ever get involved with, like, the cops or and the ICE are just a federal branch of the cops, and because they have the force of the state to justify doing pretty much whatever they want with you, and oftentimes since the state controls the courts and legal system as well, there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, personally, I wouldn't do this, but if people want to do this, I think they should be able to. Ultimately, people are going to justify what they want to justify. If they want to justify helping immigrants, whether they have legal status or non-legal status, that's on them. I personally care more about looking out for myself first and foremost. But ultimately, if people do want to help immigrants regardless of their legal status, they should have the ability to do so if they want to. Next, we have the secret recording of Henry Kissinger, secret phone recordings of Henry Kissinger, a habitual liar, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Henry Kissinger. But, ultimately, I would say he's more par for the course than for the U.S. over the past century, rather than some unique evil, just kind of like Trump in that regard. Ultimately, the U.S.'s foreign policy is gonna always be bomb other countries and try and bend them to your will. But, Reddit only seems to care about that when the government officials have an R next to their name. When they have a D next to their name, Reddit always finds a way to justify all their actions. It didn't used to be like that. They used to call out Obama a lot during his tenure, but then the Orange Man came into power, and suddenly, they always find an excuse for like Joe Biden when he's in power. When Joe Biden bombed the country, they always had some excuse, but when the Orange Man does it, all on him. And it just goes to show you that I think in a lot of regards, the president and his cabinet, they're just kind of for show. They're not really making the decisions on which countries to bomb or which countries to invade, to push regime change in. It's really the deep state actors like the CIA, FBI, NSA, and all the other alphabet agencies. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Massey calls for investigation into Zorro Ranch cover-up, posted by Jai Porcupine, and that's a tweet from Thomas Massey, who tweeted, "Investigate Zorro Ranch, as well as the men and women at DOJ and FBI who shut this part of the Epstein investigation down. Also, the Epstein Files Transparency Act requires DOJ to release memos and emails detailing their decisions of whether to investigate and or prosecute." And that was him quote tweeting Jonathan Wiseman, who tweeted, "In 2018, the state of New Mexico launched an investigation of Jeffrey Epstein's Zorro Ranch. Then the Trump-won Justice Department demanded that the state stop and turn it over to the feds. The probe then fizzled," as also reporting from the New York Times. And yeah, personally, I do think you should investigate all the Epstein stuff. But ultimately, if the government doesn't want to justify investigating it, ultimately you can't really force them to do so. Thomas Massey's in a position of government authority by being an elected representative in the House of Representatives. But the executive branch has shown they can pretty much ignore whatever the legislative branch and judicial branch of the government says, and ultimately there's really nothing you can do about it, since a lot of people just defer whatever the president and his cabinet say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. But yeah, I personally would like it if they investigated Zorro Ranch, but I don't know how likely it is. Next we have What the Fuck? No, I'm Not Okay With This, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the Steve Hofstetter subreddit, Are You Okay With This? And that looks like a tweet from Loki, who tweeted, "On the first day of the war, Israel/US bombed a girls' school. On the second day, 2 hospitals, and today, on the third day, a children's playground in Iran." And yeah, I personally don't think that's too good.
Ultimately, you have to consider 2 things here, though. One, Reddit is very much going to be anti-U.S. propaganda for the entirety of this war. I personally don't care for the U.S. or the American Empire, I should say, and it's very, very aggressive foreign policy, especially in regards to pretty much bombing the Middle East for decades on end. Bombing the Middle East is kind of the default setting for the U.S. at this point. But you have to consider 2 things. One, it's pretty, as I said earlier, this is pretty much anti-U.S. propaganda. So it might not necessarily be true. Just because someone says something on the internet, it's not necessarily going to be true. If people even want to believe that the U.S. bombed the girls' school and 2 hospitals and children's playground, I think you should be able to. But that doesn't necessarily make it true. And also, it's important to remember that civilian casualties are an aspect of war sometimes. When you bomb the Middle East so much, you're gonna be bound to hit some places that aren't just full of terrorists. It's like when under Obama the U.S. accidentally bombed a hospital. But Reddit seems to kind of memory hold that. But when Trump does it, it's suddenly the most important thing. And it just goes to show you that as I said, for a lot of people, it's no values, only teams. I'm sure if a Democrat did this war in Iran, they'd be sweeping stuff like this under the rug. But since it's a Republican, it's the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you that if you want to believe this is true or not, I don't think it really matters. I'm sure if Iran bombed Israel, people are going to believe whatever they want to believe. That's very much what social media is now. Thanks to AI, you can make AI videos of pretty much anything you want to, and convince they look increasingly convincing to convince people of pretty much anything. So yeah, personally, if you want to believe this, that's fine. If you want to believe that the U.S. is only hitting the bad guys in Iran, I think that's fine too. But ultimately, people are just gonna believe whatever they want to, and people are gonna believe whatever aligns with their narratives. I'm sure if Iran bombed hospitals in Israel, Reddit would either sweep it under the rug or say it's fake. But when it's the U.S. and Israel bombing Iran, civilian targets in Iran, Reddit's obviously going to think that's real, because ultimately people are going to believe whatever aligns with their narratives, and I think that's important to remember. This isn't justifying the U.S./Israel's attack on Iran, but ultimately you have to know that people are going to try and bend it to their narratives as well. And, that's my thoughts there. Next we have Just Remember the GOP sold American-made weapons to Iran, posted by Fasty Rubenus 739, and that's cross-posted from the Narco-Capitalism subreddit, and then it's a picture of Oliver North, who sold weapons to Iran during the Iran-Contra scandal back in the 80s. And yeah, personally, I think if if the U.S. government's probably sold arms to every country, a few of them probably ended up in ISIS because back during Timber Sycamore, the U.S. wanted to arms proliferate in Syria as much as possible, and probably some of those arms did end up in ISIS's hands. So ultimately, the U.S. government can sell weapons to whatever country it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. It's interesting; they can sell pretty much any weapons they want to the Middle East. But if I were to, if the U.S. citizen obtained those weapons without a permit, they'd go to the slammer for life. And just go show you, it's pirates and emperors when an individual does something. If they obtain an illegal weapon, they're going to or weapon without permit, they're going to jail for life. But the U.S. can throw weapons wherever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can really do about it. That's just the law. Next, we have Things We Already Knew for 500 Alex, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's a cross-post from the Immigration Pathways subreddit, and it says it's been removed by moderator, but looks like you can still see the screenshot. It's from the Minnesota Star Tribune. It says, ICE searched Minnesota to arrest criminals. Many of them were already in jail. And yeah, personally, it just goes to show you that, the government can use anything whatsoever as a pretext for its actions. They can say, oh, we just want to arrest criminals, but even if they're already in jail, they can still use that as a pretext, But also it's important to remember that, as we were talking about with the U.S.-Israel bombing Iran and how they're hitting civilian targets, the press can lie too and bend things to its agenda too, I think it's interesting. They're saying they're going to arrest criminals. Many of them were already in jail. They're not saying all of them were in jail. Maybe many's just like 40 to 50%. You don't know what you don't know. It's like Michael Malice says, the corporate press is factual but not truthful. They'll try and bend things to fit their agenda, and I think that's important to remember as well. You can't trust the government in regards to using anything as a pretext. But you can't trust the corporate press in bending things to fit its agenda either. You got to always be skeptical, whether it's from the government or the legacy media, corporate press. And I think that's very much a libertarian position. Be skeptical of every source, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have SNL's Colin Jost on Iran. This attack may be a bad idea. I don't know. I'm not really an expert on Iran, so let's hear from someone who can explain why we may have done it. Posted by Help of Eating, and that's a cross post from the Moss subreddit. And it looks like John Conjoy saying that, and he cuts to a clip from Donald Trump speaking on November 16, 2011, who said, our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. And yeah, that's very much how a lot of politicians are. They'll say one thing when they're not in office. Like, this is where Trump was even running for president in 2016, and this is back in 2011. They'll say usually they'll say one thing on the campaign trail and then do the opposite in office. It just goes to show you that, you can't trust a politician. That they'll always say one thing and then do the opposite. That's very much how politics works. You can't take people at their word. You gotta take them at what they do when they actually have the power of the state behind them. And that's politics for you a lot of the time. Reddit, of course, cares about that in regards to Trump, but Obama did a lot of that too. He said he was going to close Guantanamo Bay and never ended up doing it. And Reddit will say, "Oh, that's the Republicans' fault," but it just goes to show you that you can't trust a politician at their word, especially when they're from one of the uniparty. There are a few exceptions, obviously, like Thomas Massie tends to be pretty trustworthy, especially since he's in a position of state power and actually backing up his words of legislative action. But, outside of a few exceptions like him, most politicians aren't trustworthy and will do and say anything to get elected or stay in power. Next, we have Wars Can Be Fought Forever, posted by Jai Porcupine, and that's the truth from Donald Trump. The United States munition stockpiles have, at the medium and upper medium grade, never been higher or better. As we stated to me today, we had a virtually unlimited supply of these weapons. Wars can be fought forever and very successfully using just these supplies, which are better than every country's finest arms. At the highest end, we have a good supply, but are not where we want to be. Much additional high-grade weaponry is stored for us in outlying countries. Sleepy Joe Biden spent all his time and our country's money giving everything to P.T. Barnum Zelensky of Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars worth, and while he gave so much of the super high-end away, free, he didn't need power to replace it. Fortunately, I rebuilt the military in my first term and continue to do so. The United States is stockpiled and ready to win. Big. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, personally, my thoughts on that are, I think it's interesting. Trump campaigned against forever wars, but now he's saying, oh, wars can be fought forever and very successfully. As I said, it just goes to show you that, politicians will say one thing and then do the opposite when they actually take power. Next, we have the Lauren Boebert definition of inflation, posted by Donald Kate, and that's cross-posted from the Fluent in Finance subreddit. And that looks like a chalkboard from it looks like a screenshot of Jimmy Kimmel Live, and then he did Jimmy Kimmel with a chalkboard, and the chalkboard says, "Well, inflation is when the price of things is too expensive because of the federal government really squandering tax dollars." So you have the Green New Scam, hundreds of billions of dollars spent there under provide affordable energy, and this was not affordable, it was never free, it was never discounted. Lauren Boebert. And personally, I would kind of, she was kind of tripping on her words there, but I kind of would agree with her. Inflation is when, was one of the leading causes of collapse of the Roman Empire. It looks like it may be one of the leading causes of collapse of the American Empire, but I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. I think, if people do want to put, in regards to the Green New Scam, or, the Democrats would say the Green New Deal, I definitely do think, if people do want to spend their money voluntarily on Green New Deal energy programs, I think they should be able to. But, the libertarian position is people shouldn't be forced to spend their money on things they don't want to. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have even extreme right-wing media who makes excuses for everything, is calling bullshit on the Iran war, posted by Donald Key, and that's a tweet from Matt Walsh. He tweeted, "I can't take the gaslighting, guys. I really can't. Conservatives are now running around saying Iran is waging war on us for 47 years. Okay, then, why didn't any of you call for an attack on Iran at any point till now? Why didn't you make a case for Trump ending the war, not starting until precisely the moment when Trump did it? You and I both know that you were latching onto a talking point you never used until 45 seconds ago. You and I both know almost every conservative influencer business was opposed to war for Iran until just now, and now you're trying to use justifications that stretch back decades. It doesn't make any sense. If you changed your mind, fine, say so, explain why. You're allowed to change your mind. I've changed my mind about things, but don't try to rewrite history. Be honest about it. There's too much at stake to play these games." And, I don't agree with everything Matt Walsh says, but this is definitely correct. A lot of the influencer class on Twitter, not all of them, but definitely a good chunk of them are bought and paid for, just like legacy media. They'll say they were against the war in Iran, but now that war in Iran is actually happening, they'll suddenly be for it because the orange man's for it. And it just goes to show you that, a lot of people don't have any values other than they just have teams. And, maybe in addition, you have the almighty dollar as well, because a lot of them are probably getting paid. But, ultimately, that's very much how people work. People are going to justify whatever their team says or whatever gives them money. And that's why you have to always be skeptical of what people are telling you. You don't know, if they're getting paid or not, and if, they're just supporting it because their team's the one doing it instead of the other team. And that's my thoughts there. So I think we're gonna. Oh wait, we have another one. Video of Netanyahu defending Hitler, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the Green and Pleasant subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Netanyahu. I think I think he's the one really pulling the strings for this whole Iran attack. But ultimately, Reddit, of course, is gonna always find they're gonna be very biased against him. But so it's the video says it looks like it says Adolf Hitler didn't want to kill the Jews, but a Muslim convinced him to do it. And yeah, personally, if he wants to believe that, I think that's fine. But I think that's very much bullshit. I think people like Netanyahu are always want to hide behind anti-Semitism for to justify pretty much anything they want to, and that's why increasingly people aren't taken anymore. If you want to support Israel and Netanyahu, I think that's fine. But, the libertarian position is, you always gotta be skeptical of things, especially when it comes to foreign affairs. And Israel is definitely not entitled to U.S. support, despite how it pretty much controls the entire U.S. government through IPAC and the Israel lobby. But yeah, so personally, I think the libertarian position is, you gotta get out of Israel, you gotta stop giving Israel so much money. But, ultimately, it doesn't really matter because, ultimately people in positions of authority are going to try to justify. And, ultimately, the current federal government and a lot of state and local governments are completely compromised by Israel at this point. So there's really nothing you can do about it, I guess. Just cope and hope eventually people will wake up to the truth. It's thanks to social media, I think people are increasingly waking up to the truth. Israel, they'll just say anti-Semitism, but, like racist, sexist, misogynist, fascist, Nazi, when you say anti-Semitism pretty much all day, every day, those words are going to lose. It's going to be like the boy who cried wolf. Those words, it's not going to mean anything anymore. And that's increasingly what we're seeing in regards to Israel, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So we're going to wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.